Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. April 25th, Northwestern football players voted on whether to unionize. That came 3 months after the word first surfaced of the intention of some players at Northwestern to form a union. They announced that back on the 28th of January. There was a news conference with not a lot of advance word that it was happening, but members of the United Steelworkers, the College Athletes Players Association, Kane Coulter, who was a quarterback at Northwestern, who finished his college career last season, were on hand for the announcement, and Kane became more or less the spokesperson for the movement. So right now the ballots that were cast on the 25th of April have been impounded the day of the vote. They're in the hands of the National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB regional office here in Chicago found that Northwestern football players are employees of the university. That ruling has been appealed by Northwestern, and the NLRB in Washington is now reviewing the case, and there will be at some point a decision, and at that point then they will, I presume, count the ballots. But right now this is kind of somewhat in limbo, but there are a lot of issues swirling around it, so we can get into some of those. And I think the timing of this session today is very appropriate because there are some 24 legal challenges which have been mounted against the NCAA, including, as Paul mentioned, the Ed O'Bannon lawsuit, which has taken Lester Munson out to Oakland, California, because that trial is beginning today. So why don't we just very quickly, because it all ties in, how that works into this case at Northwestern, the rights of student athletes going forward. There's so much revenue coming in, and that's part of why this is all happening now, and we'll get into that a little bit. Rick is part of a group which has been formed called the CAgamechangers, and we can get into that a little bit as well because it is tied in to this. But Rick, as someone who played football at Northwestern, did you, when you were playing college football, ever think about a union? And did you feel that you needed some kind of representation, some kind of voice?
Well, what I've felt and what I think we're seeing here is a long process that has never been right in college football, and it all comes back to the word amateur. We don't even know what the word amateur means. They got rid of it in the Olympics because it's impossible to enforce. We don't find getting paid money to do anything is wrong in this country. In fact, that's what you aspire to if you're a kid, except to play sports. And there's something bizarre about that in that just this week we reached our first $7 million football coach.
Nick Saban.
Yeah, Nick Saban, sorry, at Alabama. And John Calipari, the first $8 million basketball coach. So that will continue to escalate. I wrote this book called The 100-Yard Lie back in 1989 because I was thinking about these things when I was playing, Dave. We're playing at Ohio State Stadium, and I look around, there's 100,000 people, and I'm thinking to myself, this has nothing to do with an extracurricular activity. These people want to see me and my Northwestern teammates die. That's what they paid to see. And if we had spears or whatever, and the other guys had nets and ball and chains, it would have been perfect. And the other part of the illogic, because you're taught to think logically in college. That's part of the problem with Kane Coulter, if you want to call it a problem. He was taught well. He's an intelligent guy. And you can't for very long suppress illogic. And that illogic is, well, I'm being paid with a scholarship. And everyone will admit that that scholarship is worth money. That's the first thing that a university spokesperson will say to you. This is very valuable what you're getting. Well, then I'm being paid, aren't I? It's just the coin that I'm being paid in. You can pay your coaches who, Jim Delaney was up here not long ago, and I was at the here at the City Club, and I want to thank all you guys. Just wonderful venue. And he was saying, well, we tried to reduce or stop what coaches are paid, but they got sued and lost $50 million. The NCAA, I believe that's what he was talking about, and that it's restraint of trade. You cannot restrain what these coaches are going to make. And the $8 million that they're making now, or $7 million, whatever it is, it'll be $10 million soon, and 12 and 15. It's not going to stop. And you'll add more and more athletic department employees, and you build bigger facilities because there's no limit on that. So the group that I'm part of called Game Changers I didn't start it, but I joined in. There's some other Northwestern players, graduates who played football back in the day. And it initially started because they felt that cane culture was being marginalized, which is what happens to whistleblowers. If you look at a whistleblower anywhere, they're discredited, they're called a malcontent. If you can, at the very start, you find something in their reputation that makes them completely lack credence entirely. Maybe they were a criminal. You say that they're greedy, you say that they're wrong. And if none of those things work, then you kind of just shuffle it under the table. Well, with cane culture, you have the star quarterback of the Northwestern football team, and he was the star. He did everything for that team. He played wide receiver, he played running back, and he was the quarterback. He met with Pat Fitzgerald on a daily basis. They were tight. He was not a malcontent, but he was a thinker. And he was a smart kid. I talked to kids at the Northwestern Daily, and I said, what kind of guy is he? Because that's who you'll find out from. Students, they say, Kane's a terrific guy. Now, I don't think that the union will hold. I believe that the players voted it down. They were virtually forced to vote it down by management at Northwestern. They were told in no uncertain terms that this was wrong. And apparently that's a legal thing you can do in labor issues. But the idea that they are workers is a fact. Now, the NLRB, the national, will review the local. And if they agree with the regional office that they're workers, this changes everything for all time. And I just wanted, I'm a guy that always brings show and tell. Last time I was here, I brought if you recall, a yellow Sun-Times miniature delivery truck. Remember that? It even had little fake pieces of newspaper in there that I bundled up. It was so cool. Yeah, it was awesome. And I held it up and showed it like I was in kindergarten. Well, this is the book called Unsportsmanlike Conduct written by Walter Byers, who created the NCAA. He was the head there, the CEO, for 37 years. He created the NCAA in the image he wanted, and this book is from the 90s when he finally retired. And I think this is telling here, because this is where he, back in the 60s, way back, he and his minions were very concerned about the idea of players being called employees. The threat was the dreaded notion that NCAA athletes could be identified as, and this is in italics, employees by state industrial commissions and the courts. Therefore, we crafted the term student athlete, and soon it was embedded in all NCAA rules and interpretations as a mandated substitute for such words as players and athletes. We told college publicists to speak of, quote, college teams, not football or basketball clubs, a word common to the pros. I suppose none of us wanted to accept what was really happening. That was apparent in behind-the-scenes agonizing over the issue of workmen's compensation for players. I had reluctantly accepted the proposal of the full ride grant aid as a device to clean up sports. I was shocked that outsiders could believe that young men on grant aid playing college sports should be classified as workers. The argument, however, was compelling. In a nutshell, the performance of football and basketball players frequently paid the salaries and workmen's compensation expenses of stadium employees, fieldhouse ticket takers, and restroom attendants, but the players themselves were not covered. Even today, workmen's compensation plans provides no coverage for disabling injuries for any injury that a player may suffer. Now, that's the guy who started the NCAA, and his awareness of this essential flaw.
I think one of the questions that's come up is, what do the players want? Or what do the student athletes, if you prefer Walter Byers' term for them, what do they want?
I don't.
Yeah, I gather.
Can I say this? What else is a person who's enrolled at a university but a student? This is Orwellian to call them student athletes with a hyphen. They're athletes. The fact that they're students, what else could they be except an employee?
Right. But there's this feeling that, okay, the players want to be paid. They're forming a union. They want to draw a salary. Neither the College Athletes Players Association, or as far as I know, the Game Changers has mentioned paying players. But that's kind of floated out there that the idea down the road is to pay college players. Herb, you've covered college athletics for years. And what you hear is, well, if we had to pay the players, we go broke, which Yeah, I think given the amount of money coming in now, that's a different issue. But what are we really talking about here? We're not talking about a salary for the players.
No, I think that initially, I mean, they're not stressing the money. In fact, just the opposite. At this point, they are talking about having a system in place where if a player needs a knee medical replacement or whatever, if you have an injury that comes up down the road, that those medical expenses should be covered. And also there should be, I think the key word to me is a voice, so that when they have an issue, they have a way to sit down and talk about it. And frankly, the best way for them to do that is through what we know as a union. I think the other thing that they might want to do is talk about, well, why can one of Rick's $8 million coaches cross the street to another job tomorrow if somebody wants to give him $10 million, but if a player wants to transfer, they have to sit out for a year. So they need a way to negotiate. Why should you have to sit out if your coach leaves and a new system comes in where you can't play because it's a different kind of a approach? Shouldn't you have a right to transfer without sitting out a year? I think those are the initial things. Then you get to the money situation where down the road they will want to get paid to a degree because that's the nature of it. The way I look at this, it's sort of like what we saw in baseball 40 years ago, where the reserve clause was thrown out and you changed the whole way that players were compensated. And I think that that's coming to college sports sooner than later.
The College Athletes Players Association lists as its goals for the players to be able to collectively bargain for things such as guaranteed coverage for sports-related medical expenses for current and former players, much as you were talking about a moment ago, minimizing the risk of sports-related traumatic brain injury, improving graduation rates, increasing athletic scholarships, and allowing players to receive compensation for commercial sponsorships, which is kind of along the lines of what's being talked about in a courtroom in Oakland, and securing due process rights for athletes, where you'll often hear about a player being suspended for a violation of team rules, but nobody really knows necessarily what that rule was, and there's no trial held, but the player is summarily dismissed from the team. And so what the CAPA is talking about is trying to get some changes in those areas. Nowhere does it mention paying the players, but you get back to the athletic scholarship. And Rick, where the shortfall comes, the real value of the scholarship versus the real cost of going to the university.
Yeah, the shortfall is agreed to be between $2,000 to $5,000. And a few years ago, the NCAA at the highest level, the football teams or the big football schools had agreed to pay an extra stipend of $2,000. Jim Delaney spoke to that, but it was voted down by the smaller members that said they couldn't afford it. So you have tremendous strata in college. We'll deal with college football right now, won't bring basketball into it, at least as far as we're speaking with Kane Coulter. The same teams win again and again. You can look at the top 20 and about 90% of the teams are the same. And it's always going to be Michigan, and it's always going to be Ohio State, and it's always going to be Texas and Alabama, and then Southern Cal. It's never going to be Indiana, Northwestern, Southwest Louisiana State. There already is tremendous disparity. So people worry about the monetary side of this are saying basically, we don't know what you would do to this system to make it equitable. It'd be a nightmare. But the first thing we have to do with anything is acknowledge what we're dealing with. Don't be hypocritical. Don't keep calling them student athletes. Say, if they're workers, so be it. What is wrong with that? We'll figure out a way to work it out. I've heard university people say, oh my God, we have to give out 1099s and W-2s and withholding, and then we've got workman's comp. Well, yes, I'm sorry, that may be the case. They are the workers. And in this book, The 100-Yard Line, The Corruption of College Football and Ways You Can Change It, what I identified after studying this for a long time, only difference between a college football player at the elite level and an NFL player is age. There's no difference. And the fact that the younger players are not paid. There is no difference. In fact, many colleges have better facilities, more coaches, and now with the national championship coming up, Dave and Herb, this is going to change everything. This starts this year. Some team is going to play likely play 15 games. Now, when you sign on as an athlete to the university, we don't even talk about the grant and aid because a lot of people think that's an unconscionable contract in and of itself. It's so one-sided. It doesn't say that you'll have any say in anything like your working conditions, how long you will work. When I started, the Big Ten, every team played 10 games, and not long before that, they played 9. Quite a few played 9. There was one bowl game, the Rose Bowl, for the best team, whether Ohio State or Michigan was going to go. That was the big decision. Now, 15 games for a long time in the NFL, they played 12 games and then 14, and they're at 16 now, and the players are adamant in that playing any more will just be too much for the human body. Throw in that these are supposed to be students. Throw in the fact that they are unpaid, that many of them come from disadvantaged places, that they have, Kane Coulter had a student athlete, if you will, hate to use that phrase, but it was players, coach, panel, and they could talk to Coach Fitz, and I think you know about this, Dave. Mm-hmm. And they would meet about issues that were going on with the team. Well, they had 49% of the vote, which I find kind of amusing. 51 is going to beat 49. They don't have a seat at the table. And what I felt when I was a player, I want some say in my future. I'm a man. I can vote. I can go to war and die. I can do anything. Why am I treated like a child? And it's a baffling thing. So what we're seeing here, the NCAA is going to address this. And the NCAA is full of white-haired men, if you will, guys like me. It's not full of players. It's not full of young guys. It's not full of workers. It's people telling the players what you are now going to do. They don't ask them. They don't ask them anything. And it's so wrong. It's so crazy that it's like one of these things that we've had for so long, and it's propped up by a rule book that is so gargantuan that you could kill animals with it. It's so big that you only need a rule book like that when you're dealing with some Rube Goldberg machine, some contraption that is so impossible to defend that you need rule after rule after rule after rule, all of which can easily be broken, all of which could be easily addressed if the players were ever taken seriously. And I think that's where we are right now with this blizzard of lawsuits. Kane Coulter's moved on, and I don't think the union issue will pass. And I'm not even saying I'm in favor of the union, Dave. I'm just saying that call them what they are. They are age group workers, and then we can deal with it from there.
I don't think too many people would look at the issues that have been brought up and say those don't have merit. And even administrators and coaches agree that a lot of these things were coming, and that there is kind of a perfect storm developing, and it has been coming. This is part of it. But I guess the question becomes, Herb, why a union versus some other way? And Rick alluded to the Leadership Council at Northwestern, which I know Kane dismissed that when he was speaking to the NLRB, said that, well, referring to Coach Fitzgerald, well, he's the boss man, he's got 51% of the vote. Still, I think if you'd gone in to sit down with Coach Agassi, you would have taken 49% back then, right?
0.9%.
Yeah. But I guess the question is, why a union? Why and why now, and why Northwestern?
Well, it's a good question. I think that it's a union because if you have anything short of a union, you don't have any teeth in it. As Rick mentioned, you're not going to have any force to do it. It's also a great attention getter, the fact that we are sitting here talking about players' union as opposed to, a council that can be rejected by coaches. I mean, that's part of it. It's also a case where they need to kind of get it out there so that people know what the issues are. I don't know that the union is really the best way to go, and I think that ultimately they will have something intermediate, but there's just so many forces at work here. I mean, the business model of college sports, college football, college basketball pay for the entire athletic department, which includes a bunch of non-revenue sports that really are draining the resources, not adding. So if you change that business model by paying players, you put a whole different spin on it, and yet players want to have some compensation for the reasons that Rick just mentioned. So, you have to start with a union because the colleges are under tremendous pressure. They're not going to yield to this without a real good fight.
And that's been a dilemma, I think, for people, because I do think the majority of people who get into college athletics, whether it's the administrators or the coaches, they get into it because they have a love of sports. They do. I know the people at Northwestern, who I've been around for years, as you have, Rick, I think they care deeply about these kids. I don't think they're not doing this because they don't have a passion for it. So it's kind of a dilemma for them because on one hand, the university takes the official stance, we're opposed to the union. And at the same time, if you're the football coach and you have affection for these kids and you know that they're the ones who have to go out there and perform for you and play for you and believe in you when they take the field against Cal on August 30th or when they go to play Nebraska or whatever, you can't lose them. It's a lot like Mike Ditka ran into during the players' strike when he kind of supported the Spare Bears way back when. So how do you balance that? If you're a coach and your players are talking about forming a union and your official position has to be opposed, but on the other hand, you want to show support for your players.
Well, since we're talking about money, which is what so many things come down to, a simple thing to me would be, maybe it'd be symbolic, but I've never heard a coach suggest it. I've never heard anyone suggest it. You're John Calipari, well, that's basketball. We'll take football. $7 million coaches, there's $5 million, $6 million coaches everywhere. What if a coach said, now, some of you guys are bankers, how much can you gift to a friend? Like $13,000 a year, free, $12,000, something like that. I don't know what it is. You can just give that to somebody if it's a gift. I've never yet heard a coach say, I'm going to take $1 million of my $7 million and distribute it to the seniors on my team. It's like, well, why? It's my money. I'm not going to do it. But you start to go crazy in the head. I do when I think about these things. And we can make these transitions slowly. It's been fomenting in my mind since the late 60s when I played. Now, I was a teenager and then in my 20s. This is not new. I've got here also my show and tell. I won't read from it. It's a Carnegie report from 1929 on college football. And everything in here, I could highlight, read all this stuff. You would think it was written today. And it says, since this corruption has been going on since 1875, we need to change this. So I'm impetuous, I guess. I'm like the Cubs say, wait, 106 years, just hold on. I don't have that much time to hold on. And it's like, do it already, okay? Could you do it? And if money is part of the deal, there's a way to do it. The minor sports will survive. All these players have been threatened with this. If you form a union, the union won't pass, I'm sure, but if you do this, then all the money for all the minor sports, tennis and volleyball, it's all going to go away, and all these poor kids are going to suffer. Well, that is absolute, utter nonsense. I saw it happen. I had a daughter who was going to college. She was a Division I swimmer, and they cut the swimming team 6 weeks after she'd been there. They raised the money to continue the team in about 2 weeks. But the athletic department didn't want to let it back because of all this blah, blah. But it wasn't about money at all. And this has happened at a number of schools. You get alums it doesn't cost much to have a wrestling program, folks. It doesn't cost a whole lot to have a women's softball team. You don't have to travel to Hawaii. You can stay in the state and play. There are many, many ways to do it. But when you have a TV audience watching you, 100,000 people in a stadium and a TV audience of millions, and you are called out for penalties, you are held up as a fool if you make a mistake, a holding call that stops a touchdown run, and your team then loses millions of dollars. If you can be held to that standard, then you certainly can be held to the standard of being an adult and being an employee. And somehow we're going to come to that. Okay, well, somehow it's going to happen. I guarantee you it will happen.
Well, and just a footnote that the CAPA has said this. Right now, only men's basketball and football are included, and the CAP has said they would not necessarily represent the so-called non-revenue sports going forward. They may never be affected or may never try or get the help of the CAPA to form a union, so it may never even apply to them. If anyone has questions, we would be glad to take some questions from the audience, and I guess raise your hand, and do we have...
Yes.
Paul?
Jack, raise your hand. There he is. You have a question? I have one already.
Okay.
Not for me. What?
And there's another one.
City Club?
All right.
Short, those questions are novel-like.
Let's see. This may be a little tough. First, I thank God for the full ride that I got to the University of Colorado, set the stage for my entire career. Second, university trustees, regents, and administrators should be held responsible for the outrageous salaries that are being paid to coaches. And that kind of gets back to what we've said. And the coaches are able to go. Basically, they sign these contracts that go till 2020, but there's a buyout in every contract.
And you know, about the athletic scholarship, yes, it was terrific for me to go to Northwestern. I'm very proud of the school. I'm very proud of the fact Kane Coulter went there. I'm proud of it for so many reasons. I'm proud of Jim Phillips, who's one of the most thoughtful athletic directors I've ever met. He has every single athlete to his house at some time during the year. But not everybody can get that. And a lot of players come from disadvantaged high schools. If you're thrown into Northwestern and you came from a place where, you know, you didn't have the greatest background, it'd be very, very tough. You know, those of us who were lucky enough to have gone to a good high school and were prepared and ready and could get the education and could do that time management, yes, it's a very valuable thing. I don't want to diminish that.
Thanks to Charles Gardner for the question. Here's another one. George Will observed that coaches at sports, in quotes, colleges and universities are paid 3 to 5 times the amount their college presidents get, and this was a reflection of the nation's values. Given the crisis in education, how do you explain this to the nation's youth? Herb?
Well, I think much as I'm appalled by the coaches' salaries, the other way that you can look at it is an Ohio State athletic budget is, what, well over $100 million these days. And if you take a comparable to a corporation that has an annual of well over $100 million, how much does their CEO make? So, you know, they can justify it in that way. I mean, it's still reprehensible when you think about where all that money could be going and the dedication of so many of these coaches. But I think that it's just competitive, and as has been noted here, you can't really put a brake on the salaries, because if you try and hold it back, you're going to be in hot water in court, and you're also going to lose your coach to somebody who will pay him more. So I guess the problem is that the really good coaches, unfortunately, are worth it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Back to the players. What power do they have? Because I keep wanting to bring this up, why something hasn't happened. They virtually have no power. They're disorganized. They come from around the country. They're 18 years old when they come to school. They've been told their whole lives, boy, if you get to play for state or tech, it's a wonderful thing. So they get there, and immediately you're thrown into the hopper. Now, freshmen didn't used to be eligible. That's one thing that could easily be done again. Keep freshmen from being eligible to play. Make them study and learn about a university instead of being thrown into this business instantly. But let's suppose that they are at this place. They don't know enough to have any kind of power to organize whatsoever. Coaches have a union. Of course, there are, administrators are all adults. They're in a profession. So by the time players figure it out, they're kind of out. They've been thrown out of the system already. So it's very, very difficult, other than the idea of a union, to figure out how else would we organize and get any kind of voice, because nobody's ever going to listen to us, ever, unless we do something. And our ultimate power, which God forbid nobody would ever do, because they would probably be labeled as traitors, American traitors, and I truly mean this, if they were to boycott a big game. Say it's a national championship game and both teams say we're not playing unless we get a cut of the pie. They would be pariahs. And yet that ultimately is the only power that anybody has, is to withhold your services. And that's one that's denied them completely.
Thanks to John Myers for the last question. And we'll take some more questions too, as you have them. I have here your 10-point blueprint for change from the NU Game Changers. It's show and tell here too.
Sure.
All right, so this is the group of which Rick is a part, so former Northwestern players, a 10-point plan. Expand sports-related medical benefits, give players the option to return to school anytime to complete their degree, expand and guarantee scholarships beyond 4 years, provide free graduate school as an option. Provide this one I really like. Provide transportation allowance to and from home during the beginning and end of each academic year. Provide transportation allowance for parents to attend 2 home games. It's very tough. You'll see parents want to go to the games, and everybody knows what airfares. And if you're a Midwest team playing on the West Coast and you're from the East, yeah, it's very difficult for a family to go watch you play. And I think all kids, they want to play in front of their family at some point. Create deferred trust accounts for endorsement and marketing deals. Increase the stipend. We talked about that. And then this is interesting, Rick, create a committee that includes representatives of your group, the Game Changers, current players, administrators, and possibly board members, I assume board of trustees,
Right.
to proactively find ways to provide the best possible protections for players. So, I mean, it seems logical that you would want to have something like that. If you truly want to give players a voice, that would be a place to do
We
it.
don't even mention pay or anything like that.
Right.
And I want to meet with Jim Phillips, and I'm going to, because he's such a wonderful. I truly mean this. Guy is,
Great. No, it's
you know,
tremendous.
He's unique. I just haven't met somebody as caring as he is. He's got 1 million kids himself, and all the athletes are always at his house. He's a great guy. Northwestern could be first. That's one of the things we want to do. We would like to see Northwestern lead the nation. Private schools, it has to start with. We know that, but we'd like to see that.
When you talked to Jim and when you talked to Fitz about this, what was their reaction?
We haven't talked really, the other guys in this group have talked to Fitz. I think he's very reasonable, he's listening. They came out publicly against the union, as you know. And Jim Phillips says he doesn't think that's the answer. Well, I don't know either, because you might be replacing, who knows who would run the union and all that. But the idea that we must treat these players as adults with an equal voice is just something that is so sane and logical that I think, Jim is going to be the head of all athletic directors, the president.
Yes.
I mean, that's a huge honor. So he has some real power. I don't know. To answer that, I guess simply, I don't know exactly what they think.
Stephen Shucker asks, if football players are to get paid a stipend, shouldn't it be an even payment for all? If not, smaller Division I schools would cease to exist on an even playing field or close to it, unless maybe you're talking about a salary cap or a stipend cap.
This is one of the problems that would need to be resolved is what do you do? I mean, you're not going to be able to pay wrestlers who aren't bringing in revenue what you pay football players just from a practical economic standpoint. And it has been suggested by people like Mike Krzyzewski that the way to get around it might be to pay these, revenue athletes based on public, media encounters, that kind of thing. I don't think that's going to fly. I think that really what you're going to get to is a haves and have-nots kind of a situation. You just basically are going to have to say that the revenue guys are going to be treated differently, which is something very difficult to do under the NCAA rules, which is why I wouldn't be surprised if down the road the big revenue schools break away, especially now with the football playoff we have. You might see the top 4 or 5 conferences break into their own group, and they're going to leave the ones that struggle, and we know they do. I think it was it Grambling last fall or one of the schools in Grambling's conference? They had their football players actually did go on strike or threatened to. Grambling because they weren't getting basic needs like washing of the uniform, and they had all kinds of money situations, which really is appalling when you think about how much money you have at the highest levels of the sport. To have such a dichotomy from one school to the other, it's a big question, and you won't be able to pay athletes equally. So you're going to just split it into haves and have-nots the way it's going.
Last question, we're going to take this from Ryan Christie. Seems the answer is for-profit minor leagues for football and basketball, like baseball. If kids want to be employees and not students, great. Thoughts?
That's a great idea in theory, but it won't happen because virtually everybody went to a university, even all of our lawmakers, and everybody that plays in the NFL right now went to a college. And so we have these rooting interests. I talked to the head guy at the University of Wisconsin, and I said, what is the deal? Why do people bond with their university? When I go and buy a washing machine at Sears, I don't then get a letter from Sears saying, your washing machine was great, how about giving us a donation? It's like, maybe they do, but I'm not paying. But the guy, he said, Rick, I thought about that, and it's like, you see that little duckling, and it comes out, and the first thing it sees at that certain age, it follows. Maybe a cat, could be you, it could be a dog, or maybe it's his mother, the goose that it follows. But it's going to follow something like that, and it's formed in his brain. This is part of me. This is something I love. I love maize, and gold. I love blue and yellow. I love purple and white. You remember your campus experiences. You believe in education. So we have rooting interests at these universities, and it's not going to end. It just will not. We have the stadiums. We're going to fill them. But what we can change is how we play those games, what the players are part of. And Herb's right. There will be the 5 power conferences. They will be much more like a professionalized model. And the lower schools can do what they do. If sports are of value, then you have them. If they're not of value because it costs you too much money, it's an arms race, well, then you can get out. Because, after all, aren't you supposed to be an educational institution?
Last question, Herb. As somebody who covers the college football landscape, how is this being perceived? How is it being watched? To what extent is it being watched around the country and all around college football?
Well, I think that the people that are really interested realize that it's kind of on the brink. I mean, as Rick mentioned, this playoff is only going to grow. It's 4 teams this year. It will be 8 teams very much sooner than later. I think people love their sports so much that there's always going to be this increased demand. And I think people will put aside the concerns that we're talking about here today because they do love purple and white or red and white, whatever the colors might be. So I don't think people are going to get overly concerned about the downside because they love the upside tremendously.
And with that, thank you very much.